We're your granddaughters.
Hi, Grams. I'm your Grams.
So if you clicked on this video, then you probably saw the thumbnail and that conspicuous question mark at the end that usually isn't there.
Who wants a ride on the rainbow bus?
Witchstock is a somewhat divisive episode in the Charmed fandom, and if you're one of those people who despises it to no end and clicked hoping for a takedown of how awful it is, well, I'll let my man Prickly say it for you.
Top nuggies.
Sorry, but Witchstock is just magnificent.
I'm not on drugs. I'm just having a bad trip.
There, I said it. I am out of the Witchstock closet and ready to let the world know. But maybe I should actually talk about the content first before we get into the who's and how's.
There's no acid allowed in the manor page. We're all on a contact high.
It's near the middle of season 6, and it's one of the few times in the series that Piper is the only single witch. Phoebe is going strong with her boyfriend/boss Jason Dean, and despite turning down an offer to move to Hong Kong with him in season 5, she was persuaded to the previous episode. Paige, too, has been snapped up by her first recurring man, this one being Richard Montana, who was part of a family feud that she helped resolve, and now she's moved in with him as well. Piper's turned the 2 empty rooms into a gym and nursery, meaning everything is in the attic with their grandmother's old things.
I refuse to believe that Grams ever wore anything this hot.
Yeah, I figured her more for steel-toed orthopedics.
Paige takes the time to go off on the fashion of the 60s.
The 60s was, like, the worst fashion era. Hello?
And I'm like, clearly the worst fashion decade was the 80s? Gen Xers tell me how great it was. I look at pictures of what people wore and go, yep, I really missed out on a golden age, didn't I? The episode is on my side and punishes Paige for that misconception when she puts on a pair of Grams' old go-go boots, and whoops, she's transported back to 1967, when Penny was a hot young hippie who had no hatred of men because she was still happily married to her first husband, Alan.
Alan, your first husband.
My first and only. I'm not that into free love.
The two preached pacifist ideals, which of course were taken advantage of by Penny's then best friend Robin, who was in league with a warlock who canonically got Alan killed, hardened Penny's heart and turned her into the fearsome demon hunter that raised the Charmed Ones.
If she hadn't killed Alan,
You'd still be a flower child.
and the Charmed Ones would be dead.
Well, that's what's supposed to happen, since Paige now being in the past could potentially damage the whole system.
What did I just do? Oh, nothing much. Just changed our entire future.
Things aren't too rosy in the 2000s either, when were they ever? Because the manor is under siege by a demonic slime that feeds on white lighter orbs, can only be vanquished by the power of 3, and for some reason doesn't have a name.
And why in heaven's name couldn't the people in the future find some name for that thing?
My thoughts exactly, Penny. Supposedly this episode was first written to feature Patty as a young hippie. Since Paige had already met and gotten to know Penny in the previous season's Happily Ever After, this would give her the chance to spend time with her mother instead. But Finola Hughes was in New York filming All My Children and wasn't available, not being able to make an appearance until Cheaper by the Coven the next season.
Leaving's always the hardest part.
As a result, there are parts of the fandom who insist that this episode wreaks merry hell with the continuity and thus is a travesty onto us all.
Penny Hallowell, Penny?
Yeah.
After all, Penny appeared in that 70s episode looking like this, and only 8 years separate that from the events of Witchstock, which is nothing compared to Once Upon a Time's Tallahassee supposedly taking place only 2 years after this flashback in family business. But that's just a matter of narrative convenience. Jennifer Rhodes, after all, was first cast to play Penny in a flashback to Phoebe's childhood, which would have been sometime in the 80s when the character was around 50, and playing her as a late 40-something was reasonable enough. But actually, Penny's canonical birth date is 1930, meaning in the Witchstock events, she's actually 36, the age of actress Cara Zedeker, who plays the younger Penny, 35. While the saying, never trust anyone over 30 is often thought of as a hippie one, it comes from activist Jack Weinberg, who was part of the New Left movement and said the quote off the top of his head, not meant to be taken seriously. So while the majority of hippies were teenagers and 20-somethings, there were a few who had been born in the 1930s, so it's not completely implausible that Penny would have gone down that road herself, especially since she says Alan was the big influence.
Your grandfather, Alan, rest his soul, was a sweet man, but he led me straight down the hippy-dippy trail.
Penny acts more like a 30-something than a 20-something anyway. Having a younger best friend is a little unusual, but Robin was trying to get close to the spiritual nexus, so she could have easily befriended Penny in a mentorship sort of role that the Charmed Ones would later have with, say, Billy, and a big part of the hippie subculture was trying to hold on to that youth that they thought would last forever. A lot of fans also mistakenly thought that Patty was portrayed as a child here, when she was going to be having babies in only a few years, but this is the only quote referencing her from Alan.
Where's Patty?
I dropped her off with my sister. She's gonna crash there tonight.
According to her official birth date of 1950, she's 16 in this episode, so it's just a teenager staying over with her aunt while her parents have a be-in. And the magical be-in refers to what began the Summer of Love, which, despite the name, started on January 14th, 1967, when 30,000 people gathered in Golden Gate Park in, you guessed it, San Francisco. Page references psychologist Timothy Leary, who said,
Tune in, turn on, drop out.
Penny's first husband is named Alan, and it's spelt this way, which means it's likely a reference to poet Allen Ginsberg, one of the organisers of the event. The episode's title naturally refers to Woodstock, one of the largest music festivals in history, that took place in 1969. You'll also notice that nobody thinks Phoebe's short hairstyle looks too modern compared to the timeless styles Piper and Paige have, because in actuality the pixie haircut was already in, thanks to Mia Farrow impulsively chopping her hair off in the middle of filming a Peyton Place episode in 1966 and popularising the style, so everyone is likely assuming that Phoebe is a Mia Farrow fangirl. For some Charmed-specific trivia, this dude right here is actually the last warlock to appear in the series, and any other enemies the Charmed Ones face are demons, evil witches, elders, and avatars. This is also the last time Phoebe levitates on screen, and she would have her powers stripped completely by the end of the season. In-universe for misusing them, but out-of-universe because the budget was getting lowered every year and the special effects were too expensive.
Astrologically speaking, Leo represents the sun.
This conversation is amusing because Paige actually is a Leo sign. And as of this, I think that makes Prue the only sister that Leo never flirted with. Poor Paige though, getting that unwanted attention from both her sister's men. In a nice bit of world building, Alan says that Paige resembles his sister Janice, who we never see, but perhaps another past life? Janice, the hippie sister, the evil enchantress, and the strongest charmed one. Now that's reincarnation. And we're now several episodes into Holly Marie Combs' pregnancy, so the tricks you see trying to hide the bump include this long scarf in a wide shot in the first scene, her holding a pillow over her stomach here, and the overall loose flowing clothes in other scenes, as well as being strategically filmed only from the chest up. And I'm not sure what to make of Phoebe spending time in Hong Kong and being obsessed with origami.
You have obviously been really busy folding.
Now actually, the Chinese did originate paper folding, and Japan was influenced by them in many ways, but I'm not going to give the Season 6 writers that much credit.
Now I should get back and finish my origami dragon.
As hard as it is to give a serious academic discussion on another comedy episode, this whole thing is just magnificent.
The grandfather clock.
I mean, witches and flappers is one thing, but witches and hippies?
Turn their hate sticks into flowers.
The redesign of the manor is very fun, and while it is very much the theme park version of the 60s, I dig it. I dig very much.
Right on.
It's a Season 6 episode that has both heart and fun, and it is a breath of fresh air.
What do I usually do at this point? You usually do something very final, if you catch my drift.
It's not quite operating on rule of cool, because I don't think anyone would put something like this in there unironically. But it's rule of fun, and that's good enough for me.
Make him good for the ecosystem?
I actually quite like the B-plot, which seems like another 60s homage. In this case, the monster movies that were all the rage like The Blob, which was technically released in 1958, but had its biggest cultural impact in the 60s, which I may have done a short film inspired by.
What are we gonna do?
Can we just let the commies take over so they have to deal with it?
This solution suggested by Leo seems to be a reference to how the Blob was dealt with in the movie,
We could orbit to an ice drift.
although this scene actually makes me think more of Rugrats. And even if this was meant for Patty originally, I do think it was for the better that it became a Penny episode.
Like you said, Piper, it's okay to fight for someone you love, right?
Although we did touch on her past in Necromancing the Stone, this humanizes her, and allows us to get to know her as more than the cantankerous demon hunter who hated men. And as much as she can be a bit hard to take depending on the episode, I like Penny overall, and Jennifer Rhodes' performance is always welcome. Here she gets to camp it up and does not disappoint.
Have you tried talking to the slime?
We might question why she reverts to hippie persona while Alan is temporarily not dead, but that question would mean we can't enjoy Jennifer Rhodes as a granola girl, so let's just ignore it.
Come here, Moonbeam.
Wyatt. His name's Wyatt.
This warlock might be in the top 5 hammiest villains on the show.
Where in the hell are all the witches?
It's neck and neck between him and these dudes.
What are you gonna do? Cast another love spell?
Holly Marie Combs' Snark is very welcome too.
I'll probably end up hating men for the rest of my life.
Well, she's got us there. Those were our potions. Now she's just showing off.
And what with Paige being my favourite of the charmed ones and season 6 being the specific one where she's really trying to help as many people as possible, I like that this episode is one where she's the driving force, and the innocent she ends up needing to help turns out to be her own grandmother. And she gets to lead the Power of 3 spell and get rid of the slime. And on the House of Halliwell podcast, Brian Krause has been pointing out that Leo is a bit of a creep in the early seasons, so it's quite amusing that this episode somewhat canonizes that interpretation.
There's an empty room upstairs, you dig?
No, I don't dig.
He's very well suited to playing a Chad, actually, and I love this exchange way more than I should.
Hey there, sun god.
Hey, that was a long time ago. Let's just...
So yeah, that's Witchstock. Is it one of the greatest episodes? Well, probably not, but it works.
Glad to know I have groovy grandkids.
I love it. It's fun. It's unique. It's a visual treat. And it actually doesn't disregard 6 seasons worth of continuity for the sake of its gags.
Oh, my powers must be down. Must be the past. Past few minutes.
Although it did depress me somewhat when I realised that this was an audience looking back on their youth the same way media today is looking back on the 80s and 90s, and you can imagine that depression will increase tenfold when the 2000s become old enough to get the same treatment. Oh, and this is my friend Nathan. I nicknamed him Sun God because of this episode. The internet has spoken.
Good night, Moonbeam.